First item on the agenda is public comments. Nobody has contacted me. Does anybody wish to make a public comment? Any public comments? If not, we will move on to the approval of the minutes from the January 11th meeting. What are your wishes?
Move to approve.
Gillen to approve.
Moved by Arstead, seconded by Gibbs to approve. Any discussion? If not, all is in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Next item will be an overview of the Department of Treasury final rules relating to the use of fiscal recovery, the fiscal recovery fund dollars, or the American Rescue Plan fund. NACO prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Are you able to pull that up and share that? Christie, I sent it to you as well.
When did you send it? I don't have a
Now,
PowerPoint.
Let me see, I thought I sent it this afternoon. Let me make sure it's not in drafts. It's in drafts, so. All right. Chair Gibbs and I were part of a call this afternoon with the NACO's district meeting, and they did an update on providing an overview, but they also earlier this month had done one and provided an overview on their website relative to the changes. Chair Gibbs, do you want to highlight those changes? I think if we're pulling those up, page 2 highlights many of the important changes, and we can drill down into them if we need to.
Sure, thank you, Mr. Chairman. First off, NACO has worked diligently to try to provide guidance, and they also have recorded, there was a meeting that was following the Central Regional call. It started at 2 o'clock this afternoon, and they quickly maxed out, and they were specializing on one particular item, and that is the new final rule on lost revenue. And those are going to be recorded, and so they'll be available for your review if you choose to. And next Thursday, there's going to be another one, and that is going to be on specifically a presentation on one of the changes on broadband expansion. But the high-level changes that are now in the final rule becomes effective April 1st, 2022. Even though it becomes effective April 1st, if you choose to, you can use the interim final rule if you've expended some ARPA funds already, and you expended them under the provisions of the interim final rule. But you can also use the default as the final rule that really technically doesn't go into effect until April 1st. If you're going to expend funds under that, all of those are to say that Treasury will not try to recover or recapture any of those funds if they're spent in accordance with the interim final rule and or the final rules. One of the major changes is the lost revenue calculation and what they now are calling a default or a standard lost revenue amount. Any municipality or any county government, any county that has received less than or will receive less than $10 million of ARPA funding, they can elect to treat up to all $10 million of their ARPA funds as lost revenue, which then releases it from the categories that the ARPA funds is spelled out as far as special classifications and utilization. And so what that really means is if the entity, whether it be county, whether it be town, whether it be city, village, if their amount of ARPA funds are less than 10 million, every bit of their funds can be used under lost revenue, which then allows them to use those funds for anything that municipal entity is allowed to legally utilize those funds for. So if it were allowed to use it for a capital project previously other than under ARPA, in other words, if the county could go and build a highway building prior to ARPA, and you utilize now ARPA funds, up to $10 million under lost revenue can be utilized to do that. So that's a major change, really, in essence. In some cases, it's created challenges because, some of the restrictions before, was trying to target where those funds were going. Now it basically opens it all up. And what that really means, there's 3,069 counties in the United States. 2,137 of those counties now have received less than $10 million. And what that means is those 2,137 counties can utilize all of their ARPA funds for anything that county government can do. So that's a major change. There's some improvements in the lost revenue calculation that wasn't, if you don't use the standard $10 million calculation, you can still use the lost revenue calculation. The lost revenue calculation's been updated. So under the previous set of rules, you had to go and get a base period, 2019, 18, 19, and 20, and determine what your rate of growth was in your revenue. And if your rate of growth in that base period was less than, under the old rule, or the interim rule, less than 4.1%, you could calculate 4.1% as the increase, and whatever that difference was deemed to be lost revenue. Well, that calculation default now has changed to 5.2%, which is a significant increase. And so now we can go back and recalculate our lost revenue utilizing, again, the base, the 3-year base average. And now, instead of using 4.1%, project in a 5.2%. and come up with what the lost revenue actually is. And the reason that that is really significant is that if, for example, in Marathon County's case, where Marathon County's ARPA funding for the 2 years is going to be roughly $26 million, obviously it's greater than 10 million, so we could use the standard amount of 10 million of lost revenue, or we can use whatever the actual number is. And Christy, I don't know, did you find the calculation? I misplaced the numbers that you had provided earlier. Was roughly 7 million?
Yeah, with the Marathon County and the Mount View for 2020, the calculation stood at 6,859,000. And as you're speaking, I'm trying to figure out what it would have been at the 5.2, but it is almost $7 million for Marathon County and Mount View for 2020 alone.
Okay. So, if we look at that and say, okay, the lost revenue is roughly $7 million, obviously that number is going to go up based on the increase in change to 5.2. But we also have 2 additional years to calculate that loss. We've got the 2021 loss to calculate now. We won't have those numbers finalized until the audit is complete, but then we will be able to calculate that number. And we add that to the 2020 loss, and assuming that the 2021 loss is going to be at least the same or greater, we're going to have 14 million just from 2 years, and if you use 3 years, it could be as much as 21 million. And it could be even significantly higher now that we have a 5.2 inflation factor instead of 4.1. And the reason that that's really significant is now it allows the county to utilize those funds under that calculation. And really, other than verifying the lost revenue calculation number, as long as the expenditure is authorized under state statute for the county to do, Marathon County can do anything it wishes with those funds for basically, for anything that it needs to. And that prevents the Treasury from saying, well, you wanted to pigeonhole this project under, say, for example, a disproportionately impacted population. And later they determine, well, that population wasn't disproportionately affected. If you still use the funds for that disproportionately, what you deemed disproportionately affected, under the lost revenue calculation, it doesn't matter. The Treasury can't recapture those funds from the county. We can just say, yep, we used them under this program for what we thought was disproportionately affected. Yep, you say it doesn't qualify. Well, I don't care. We're using it under the lost revenue, and now the Treasury can't recapture those. So that's why it's significant. It lessens the burden of documentation to prove that it fits into one of the eligible categories that the treasurer, other than lost revenue. There's been some clarifications on eligible funds for capital expenditures. In the past, there was the definitions weren't quite as clear. They now have been clarified in the final rules. There's been some presumptions of populations that were impacted. In the past, you had to be able to prove. So now they've tried to soften that and saying, yep, this population, if they were an industry that was tourism, clearly they were affected by the pandemic. And disproportionately. If they were in the food service, if they were in the restaurant industry, those were businesses that were adversely affected by the pandemic and are eligible entities or groups that would qualify. Streamlined some options for premium pay and made some assumptions that employees would qualify for premium pay as long as they're government employees, as long as the majority of the time they were they were working from their place of business rather than working at home. Authorizes rehiring of local governmental staff to pre-pandemic levels. So in some municipalities and some entities cut staff because of pandemic, because they lost revenue, lost money, didn't have the revenue that they needed, so they cut staff. So now you can utilize ARPA funds to rehire those individuals back to pre-pandemic levels. Another major change that was a major win was it allows the recovery funds to be utilized for modernization of cybersecurity. So in the past there had to be a link to the pandemic, and now it's basically saying cybersecurity is so critical, you can utilize those funds for there. And then It broadens the use of the funds for water and sewer projects to include culvert repair, dam, and reservoir rehabilitation. It broadens, again, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it broadens the infrastructure investments and allows to utilize now. In the past, if any area had 25 down and 3 up, they were considered served, and you couldn't basically use ARPA funds to expand broadband in that area. Now they're saying if the area has less than 100 down and 20 up, they will be considered eligible areas. There still is a recommendation that you have that your target speed for those areas are 100, but they have given a lot more latitude to say, yep, we know that you may not be able to achieve that, and so they've provided some flexibility for areas that wouldn't qualify for that. That's really some of the highlights. I don't know if you wanted me to go into more detail with that, John, or again, everybody can see the power slides, but if there's any questions, I'd try to help answer any of those questions I can.
Thank you for that overview, but I think it highlights again, why we needed to be diligent and keep paying attention to what the Department of Treasury is doing, because the rules have changed, and it now looks like these will be the permanent ones guiding us. And just as a refresher, we need to encumber those dollars by December 31st of 2024 and spend them by December 31st of 2026. So actually, we'll have 3 years of lost revenue coming up, 20, 21, 22, and 23. So that will give us the maximum amount of flexibility. I think there's still an underlying assumption that we'll apply many of those to pandemic relief to try to help those people that have been impacted negatively through this pandemic. So thank you for that overview. Any questions? Any questions? I will be participating in the call on Thursday on the broadband and just trying to get that a better understanding of where that's going. So,
Chairman Robinson, I just did a quick calculation. If the rate goes from 4.1 to 5.2%, and this is just doing it right here, you've increased your lost revenue in 2020 based on the base lost revenue calculations from 6.86 million to 8.3 million. That's almost a $1.5 million change, because I believe you can retroactively take those lost revenues, even though the guidance starts on April 1st. I believe you can take it back. So that would be what I would be reporting with the new guidance for 2020's lost revenue. So the total would be between the Marathon County and the Mount View Care Center would be 8.3%, or 8.3 million, I believe. Now, I just did that very quickly, but that's how much a dramatic change it would be for Marathon County.
thank you for that update. Any questions? Any questions? If not, we will move on to the discussion of possible action by the committee relative to the criteria, process, and timelines for distribution of the American Rescue Plan Act funding. In your packet, you had the application request form, which gets at that process issue. Administrator Leonard and I had a conversation earlier this afternoon about adding an additional criteria consistent with what we had talked about back in September on how does, adding another category of how does the project benefit the disadvantaged, public health, and disproportionately impacted communities. So, Lance, do you want to?
right, thank you, Chair Robinson. So you'll see on the screen that I'm sharing, and I believe this is in one of the recent packets that Christie was able to post today, but in light of the conversation that I had with Chair Robinson, we essentially made, Sarah was able to make a couple of changes to the draft form. And the first one you'll see is really allowing for a greater explanation of the expenditure categories that Christie and Board Chair Gibbs have previously referenced, really allowing the individual applicant and requiring the individual applicant to expound upon how the project qualifies under the expenditure category that they are proposing it qualify under. So that is the first modification we made relative to the form. The other additional clarification relates to the idea that we're asking applicants to expressly indicate, how the project directly addresses the negative impacts of the pandemic. So not only describing the project in general terms, describing the project in terms of how it relates to the county's goals, including those set forth in the strategic and comprehensive plan. But you'll see on the top of the screen, the top of the second page of the application, we called out specifically this idea, how does the project directly address the negative impacts of the pandemic? We gave a couple of examples: economic impacts, disproportionately impacted communities, and public health. So those were the changes that we made to the form, but otherwise the form is consistent with the documents that you saw in the original posted packet, and specifically those that related to the proposal that is before you relative to the use of ARPA funding for the PTO buy down, the service delivery protection proposal that's before you. I don't know, Chair Robinson, if you wanted anything else in terms of additional information there?
I think what we're looking for is the project request form. Are you comfortable with the project request form from the perspective of a process? Are there questions relative to that? Are you comfortable that it?
Mr. Chair,
Go ahead.
Mr. Chair, this is Chris. Thank you. Just one question about the question where how does it align with the strategic and comp plan? Should there be a link for them to be able to click on for that or not? Or is we just they'll just have to search that out? I'm just wondering if it'd be easier to have the link for the comp plan and the strategic plan.
We certainly can add a link. I think that's a very sound suggestion to make sure that the individuals have the ability to access that and understand what our goals are set forth in both. We can do that. Thank you.
Gibbs?
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I guess the only question that I have is, we're asking them to identify the category for eligible use when they fill out the application. Ultimately, that's going to be that responsibility of verifying that they qualify if we choose to go down that road and pigeonhole any of the projects for a specific, rather than using lost revenue. How are we, I guess the question becomes, how are we going to, one, ensure that they qualify for whatever bucket they want to utilize it under? And then two, even though they may qualify under that, do we want to default it to on our reporting under lost revenue? And my thought is, based on what now is being told to us, that the potential lost revenue is 8.3, and if you use even if you used 8 million times the 4 years, you're clearly going to be way above the 26.3 million that we are going to receive from ARPA. So wouldn't it be to our advantage simply from a recovery point to say, nope, everything's going to be under lost revenue, rather than under addressing a negative economic impact? I just throw it out for discussion for questions.
My only concern, I have a couple of concerns with that is, first, we can report it as a lost revenue item. So I think what we're trying to do is just make sure, one of the reasons why I'd like to see those boxes checked is for some transparency in how those dollars are allocated. Or we look at those categories in the context of, are we responding to the pandemic as such? And we can ultimately choose to put something for evaluating it and responding to the public health emergency, but then take the funds out of the lost, the revenue loss. And I understand the administrative burden of proving that, but I think we would still want to track that for transparency. We can say that Marathon County qualified for $26 million of lost revenue. We chose then to allocate those dollars for projects that help public health or serving the hardest hit or addressing negative impacts. So we would have a way of tracking that. And if you take that out, we wouldn't have the ability to necessarily create those buckets. I fully agree with you of trying to maximize our flexibility, but I think when we have somebody submitting an application, we should ask them to at least look at the criteria and say that these are the criteria that they meet, and again, maintaining that flexibility. That's why there's an advantage of having it on there. Any other questions or comments? Are you comfortable with the form and proceeding with this? I guess we're looking for administration. This will come in and go to the administrator. The administrator will then evaluate it, and they'll bring it ultimately back to us as a committee, and we'll ultimately have to take it to the full county board. So are you comfortable with the criteria as we've laid it out?
Chair Robinson, Supervisor Fisher here.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I'm very comfortable. I think the form has a good level of usability to it. As someone would be coming, if and when someone comes with a particular project. So I think the form will be good. And then of course, I think it'll be easy to work through identifying the areas that they would like to use the project for, knowing that whether or not we've moved in the direction of potentially just securing the funds first and then using them in that fashion. But for the form itself, I think it's good.
Chair Gibbs?
Just a question on the so HR Finance is going to be the committee of review, and they can approve or deny a project. I guess I'm just questioning what's the process that we're going to utilize for review, because we've got forward to department head for review. So I'm trying. Help me understand what that process looks like. So I submit a project. Does that first come to Finance Committee and then to the administrator, then Finance, then Department Head, then to the full board? I guess I'm trying to understand what, how what the process is, what we're going to utilize.
I'm going to look to Sarah. Didn't you at one time prepare a flow chart, or am I thinking? So can you pull that up? And perhaps we should share that.
As Sarah works to pull up that form, I think to your specific question, Chair Gibbs, the reason we reference department heads there, the the applications for projects would come into administration.
Right.
And there are a fair number of projects, particularly those that would come from outside the organization, where I have insufficient expertise in an area, and I would turn to an individual that within our organization that perhaps would be able to better assess whether a project meets a certain eligibility criteria or the specific questions that were answered well relative to how it aligns with our strategic plan goals or comprehensive plan goals, the potential impacts to county operations. So I'd reach out to a department head in that instance. If the if the request is an internal request from a department head, of course, that would be unnecessary. As the form is laid out, and I think Sarah's document that she put together that was in a previous packet that was reviewed by this committee, in terms of flow after that, the administrator would have, I would have the opportunity to provide comments as set forth on page 2, or excuse me, at the bottom of page 2 of the form, essentially providing my thoughts relative to, one, is the project appropriate as submitted? Is it eligible as submitted? The length of the time that the project would be budgeted for, and just general comments to the HR Finance and Property Committee for review. And then similarly, that final step, after consideration by the HR Finance and Property Committee, it is envisioned that all projects, based on the way that we have operated thus far, all projects would have to go to the county board based on a budget amendment. But I don't know, Sarah, if you have anything you want to add, or Christy, if you have anything you want to add based on previous discussions and how we laid out that form?
That's accurate. I'm having an IT issue at the moment.
And it's not to be critical, I just want to be clear so that we're not going to be criticized that we're not following a process. That's the only, for an outside entity to make a application and then come back and say, well, you used a different process for an internal request versus an external request, and it didn't follow the same steps. That's, I don't want to be criticized by the general public saying that we didn't utilize that same process. That's the only reason I want to provide and have clarity to what the process is going to be as far as review. If that makes sense.
If I can add one piece, I completely appreciate that comment, and one of the things that we've discussed within my office is the intent to bring even projects that administration does not recommend for utilization of ARPA funding, to bring those for information to the committee, and certainly the committee can take any action it chooses to with respect to each of those projects.
Okay, all right.
But I think to Chair Robinson's point, certainly I appreciate the desire for enhanced transparency relative to these funds. The project request form is really an attempt to encourage strongly any applicant to provide relevant information in a fashion that is more easily digestible than perhaps a long memo about a project, to try to get the information that the committee has specifically addressed in past meetings. And if there are additional thoughts, as referenced by Supervisor McEwen, anything else we can incorporate into the form, certainly happy to do that.
This is Palmer. The only thing I would mention is that the funds are Marathon County, and therefore, in some way, shape, or form, we'll have to allocate them through the county system. So I believe that assigning a department for that guidance is appropriate, whether it's internal or external, because that way we can then probably once it hits the administrator's desk and then moves through the process, we kind of have someone that's able to guide it through that process or answer additional questions.
So if you go back to our September 28th meeting in the packet, and there are timelines on proposed draft timeline that we talked about. From a process perspective, where we looked at applications coming in, committee review, and county board approval. And we had a number of target dates of January 15th, June 15th, October, 3 calls a year. Do we still want to, do we want to continue that from a process perspective that would help us look at those and lump them or not? I think we agreed in concept to that approach, but I think what we're looking for is how do we flow, and if we use this form, maybe we want to create a section 3A with the date of the county board review and approval, just for tracking, and then we can, if you wanted to have something all-inclusive, but we could add additional action and comments from the committee and potentially from the county board. It's just a way of tracking, but. Sarah, were you able to find that, was that the only flow chart? For some reason, I was thinking there was a different one.
There's another one, unfortunately, I've lost internet connection, so I can't get to any of my stuff at the moment. We can take longer lists.
I am sharing the screen from your, the meeting that you referenced, Chair Robinson. My initial inclination is I think the batching idea it made logical sense when we were having the discussion, wondering how many applications we're gonna get. To this point, we haven't been inundated with requests. Not to say that we won't. But, you know, at this point, I'm not overly concerned about capacity within the administrator's office relative to examining the requests as they come in and getting the supplemental information for this committee to fully consider them, at least at this point.
Would it make sense for us to monitor the frequency of the request and then react if we're overwhelmed? I think the concerns would be twofold. One is the workload and expectations on you, and secondly would be the demands on the fund to make sure that we have enough funds to carry us forward through this period. So I'm comfortable with deferring to you and your professional judgment, and if you think that there's a necessity to impose deadlines and schedules, but it was something that we, again, had looked at as a committee earlier, and want to make sure that we have eyes wide open.
If I could add one thing, I think that your point about, the second point about capacity in terms of applications and impact on the funding available, I think was also my greater concern, that, you know, if you're a project applicant and you don't have confidence and there's not a shared understanding that the county board is not going to allocate all of the funds in the first year, there's an inclination or an inherent pressure to submit your application very promptly. If there's an understanding that those funds are going to be expended in a bit more slowly, there's less likely to be that wave of applications.
Chair Gibbs?
I think the other thing is there was an expectation, or potentially an expectation by the outside entities that are applying, that there's going to be some it's going to be disposed of at some point. Mm-hmm. So in other words, if I'm going to submit an application in January, I know that at least theoretically it was that by March we were going to actually take some action, so that we're not stringing them along. That's the other side I think that we need to be concerned with. But I appreciate the chair's thoughts as long as administration has the capacity and it's not overburdensome. We've already brought some projects from within internal for utilization in the court system and the upgrades in the court system, and rightfully so, and the board's approved that. We've got a couple more projects that are here today, but I like that approach. But if it does, we can fall back to the quarterly thing if we have to.
Other thoughts? Other thoughts? All right.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve the utilization of the application ARPA project request form as presented and discussed.
McKeown, second.
And that incorporates those changes that were in the packet from the
Absolutely.
earlier version. Okay.
Correct. Correct.
Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will
Go-
signify.
Mr. Chairman,
Go ahead. The viewing audience needs to hear you.
Okay. So with what Craig McKeown, Supervisor McKeown put in there as adding that link, would that be included in what Chair Gibbs
It's
just?
an editorial change, so yes.
Okay,
And we would also, I would assume that we would want to track the county board approval on that as well as if that's acceptable. 'Cause they're
Correct.
more editorial and,
yep, absolutely.
is that agreeable to the second for clarification?
second?
No, for Chair, Craig or Supervisor McEwen, is that it?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
You can be the third.
I'll be the third. Okay.
All right, any other discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no? I think, that motion carries. In light of the fact that this is going to be a learning process, we will be probably checking in and revisiting our guidelines and processes as we go through and as we learn. I know that Marathon City is interested in a timeline. I know that there are some other parties that are external to the county that would like to know. We've had the CPZ request for the Fenwood watershed and others. So we'll see how this works and as we go forward. All right. Anything else? It might be helpful. The intent is to take this to take a presentation to the county board next week. So maybe if we could work with Sarah on that flow chart, and I think that's more of an administrative operational issue, but if we could present that to the county board so that they can understand it, so that the concerns that Chair Gibbs raised are addressed, we'll try to do that between now and then for clarification purposes. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. Consideration of authorizing expenditure of the ARPA funding for leasing space with Community Partners Campus, and you had that last week, and we delayed that until today. Do we need an explanation that is, again, to enter into a 5-year lease with Community Partners Campus for the purposes of making Marathon County services available to the population served at $4,200, $4,300, just under $4,300 a year? Any thoughts, questions?
Mr. Chair.
Super.
Go ahead, Supervisor Fisher.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Just a quick question for clarification's sake. The 42,900 would cover that entire lease period. Is that correct?
This is Administrator Leonard. So you do have in one of the subsequent packets that was posted today, a draft resolution. And the resolution, thank you, Corp Counsel, for putting that together. Essentially what it does is it takes that $4,290 cost, that is the projected cost from the Community Partner Campus for the designated space within the proposed lease, and expands that to a 10-year term, which is their standard term. However, the resolution as drafted authorizes the administrator, based on action from the board, to work with the Community Partners Campus to develop a final lease utilizing the American Rescue Plan Act dollars up to that 10-year term. I have significant concerns about the ability to utilize ARPA funds for a project that would have a 10-year term based on all the information that Board Chair Gibbs referenced in his overview of the utilization of ARPA funds, but it would allow me to have the opportunity to work with the Community Partners Campus to effectively negotiate a lease. At this point, I don't have the direction from the board to do that. So the resolution is drafted relatively broadly to provide that general direction and provides for a budget amendment up to, but not more than that 10-year total. I hope that answers your question, Supervisor Fisher.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Administrator Leonard. Just to follow up to that, I appreciate the additional detail just around the leasing factor itself. Secondarily, and please forgive me if I missed this, but this space that we would be renting to, essentially operate a storefront, quote unquote, where were these services being offered out of before this rental would go into effect?
The services are currently offered, and my answer is going to be relatively general because we haven't decided what services truly to offer within the space. The services that, in my estimation at this point, make the most sense to deliver out of that storefront, as you referred to it, at the Community Partners Campus would be services designed around or centered around eligibility determinations that we currently do at the Aging Disability Resource Center, eligibility determinations that are performed by social services, perhaps some eligibility determinations that are done by the Veteran Service Office. Right now, I don't have in my mind a clear understanding of what those services would be with respect to the county side. I do know North Central Healthcare has also had discussions with the Community Partner Campus about utilization of that space. And in my initial conversations with the Executive Director of the Community Partner Campus, one of the areas that I would like to follow up on is the general prohibition within their lease on subleasing to other potential tenants. In my conversation with the Community Partner Campus, in an email conversation, it appears that they would be willing to waive that, and I think that's one of the things I'd want to look into is what are the partnerships that might exist for the county in the operation of that storefront, whether it's with North Central Healthcare or the City of Wausau, the ADRC, what other entities might we want to partner with so that we have a presence there to interact with the population that is going to the Community Partner Campus to receive services that they're providing, in effect to meet them where they are and be more efficient. But I don't have in my mind a very clear contemplation of what that's going to look like as of yet.
So you're effectively just looking to centralize, kind of a one-stop shop for the eligibility considerations of most of our services.
Yeah,
just to have them all kind of.
I think that's accurate. Right now, that's the whole point of the Community Partners Campus is to be that quote-unquote one-stop shop. I think Supervisor McEwen brought this point up at a previous meeting, and I think it's very important to note. This is not in terms of a need that we have based on a lack of suitable space for our office, for our staff to operate in. We have more than enough space. These staff are currently delivering services out of existing spaces. The question is just, do we want to have a presence at the Community Partners Campus in light of the work that the campus is doing, again, essentially working to provide that one stop for people to get those services.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, this is Craig.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I know at exec, we talked about this last week, and I guess I'm a little confused. We weren't sure about the length of 10 years, but there was some discussion about possibly a 5-year. Before this, like I said, I have a have an issue with a 10-year lease, but like I said, is this going to be determined, and is it going to be determined by the administrator, or does it come back to the board?
I think if this resolution passes, it is the administrator. From an, Mike?
How about that? Thank you, Mr. Chair. That is how it's currently written. The resolution would allow the administrator to draft, with assistance of county staff, the lease. The amount would be not to exceed that amount for a 10-year lease. However, it would be up to the administrator to determine the exact terms.
So any questions? Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question, and I think the administrator alluded to this a little bit, is the potential challenge or the difficulties of using ARPA funding for more than 5-year out, and if we can't do that, does the resolution provide, if the administrator still deems it appropriate to do a 10-year lease, and ARPA can only account for $21,450 of it, do we have a additional source of funding for the other $21,450, or would that come back to the committee for recommendation? I would, if we're going to do it and provide the administrator the flexibility to negotiate that up to 42.9, and we see the challenges already with ARPA, do we have an opportunity to identify the other 21,450?
Mr. Chair, if I may answer that question, as it's currently written, the resolution does not account for a separate funding source. In fact, it specifically identifies the sole funding source as ARPA. So if the committee were to identify a separate funding source, that could be built into an amended resolution, but it's not currently in there as written.
Administrator Leonard?
And this is, I appreciate the clarification, Corp Counsel. I'll just tell you my intent is if my examination along with Corporation Counsel's examination is such that we do not believe American Rescue Plan Act funds can be utilized beyond the 2026 timeframe, which is my current inclination, I will not sign a lease that goes beyond that timeframe without further authorization from the board, because I think the board would be giving me clear direction that the American Rescue Plan Act dollars are the source of funding, and I won't encumber the organization beyond that.
So while that's the stated intent, is there a way for us to put in language to ensure that it is contingent upon ARPA funding eligibility?
Mr. Chairman, I think it's already in there, actually. If you read it, be it further resolved, the county shall lease and be paid for using American Rescue Plan ARPA funding for negative impacted such as lost revenue, but it doesn't allow for any other funding source. So I think it's already restricted, in my that's my opinion, but I would defer to Corp Counsel.
Mike is nodding his head yes.
I'll follow up the nod by saying yes. That's how it's currently written. And I guess I would piggyback off of what Administrator Leonard just indicated, which is, I think, the analysis of whether we can encumber the county beyond when the ARPA funds extend to is a question we need to analyze. If the answer is no, then this would allow the administrator to negotiate a lease up to the length of time that would would be allowed, but would not require him to use the entire amount of funds that's specified in there. It's an up to, but not to exceed.
With that clarification, what are your wishes?
Mr. Chair, this is Craig.
Go ahead.
I guess, so we gonna revise this resolution to make sure that that's in there, that we will not go past the ARPA funds ability? Or, I mean, I assume the administrator knows that, but it should be in the resolution.
I think that was the point that the Corporation Council just met, or just addressed in the last be it further resolved on the first page of the resolution, that language limits us to only those periods of time. We can only have the lease in that period of time because we're only paying it with the American Rescue Plan funding. So in essence, that provision puts that limit in place.
A follow-ups. So we're going to take the 10-year lease out of there.
We are giving, the intent of the resolution is to give the administrator the ability to negotiate a lease. The lease has, the limitations on the lease is that it can't exceed 10 years and that it cannot exceed $4,200 or $42,900 in total. And it has to be paid for using the American Rescue Plan Act funding. So if the determination is made that we can pay for services beyond the December 31st, 2026 deadline, this would allow us to have a lease beyond that December 31st, 2026 deadline. And if not, the lease would need to be reflective of that time period in which those expenses are allowed. So that's implied in the resolution. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm getting a thumbs up from Corporation Council. Any other questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, this is Craig again.
Go ahead.
I still have a concern about the intent with the 10 years. If we sign a lease for 10 years and in 5 years down the road, our ARPA funds are gone, if you sign the lease for 10 years, that's 10 years. We got another 5 years. We're gonna have to figure out where we're gonna get the funds from.
If I may, Mr. Chair. Supervisor McEwen, I think I understand your question, and I hope this clarifies that I would not have the ability to, under the current language within the resolution, if we determine, myself and Corp Counsel and any other staff that we bring in to look at the American Rescue Plan Act final rule limitations, if we determine that the limitations do not allow for funds to be used for a lease that goes beyond December 31st of 2026, based on the terms set forth in the draft resolution, do not have the ability to sign a lease that goes beyond that term. So to your express question of would I have the ability to sign a 10-year lease, that the answer to that question is determined based on whether or not it is our determination, Corporation Counsel, myself, and others, if I legally can utilize, if the county legally can utilize ARPA funds to go beyond that December 31st, 2026 deadline. And I will say within the resolution, I don't believe that there is a term specified 10 years or 5 years or anything within the resolution. I was simply referencing that the standard term that the community partner campus has for a lease currently is a 10-year term. However, they indicated that they would be willing to entertain a shorter lease term because, again, that was one of my concerns, that if American Rescue Plan Act funds cannot be utilized for a lease with a term beyond December 31st of 2026, I wanted to make sure that the board would know that, and that the resolution would empower me to negotiate a lease up until that point, but no further. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
So I stand corrected in my explanation. It's not a 10-year lease, but a lease to be determined based upon eligibility of ARPA funds. So with that, are there any questions? If not, what are the wishes of the committee? That's a hint that I'm looking for a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we authorize the administrator to negotiate a lease of space with the Community Partners Campus as spelled out in the resolution, and move to the full board for its consideration.
Is there a second?
He will second.
Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no? That motion.
No.
There was one no, so it is not unanimous. But that motion carries. All right, next is Uniquely Wisconsin program offered by the Wisconsin Counties Association and Discover Wisconsin. You received an overview of that at the last meeting. There's information in the packet. Anything you'd like to add, Administrator Leonard? Again, this is aimed at trying to help the tourism industry that was negatively impacted. Any questions from the committee? Any questions from the committee? If not, what are your wishes? I do have a question for Administrator.
Supervisor Leahy?
Moved by Supervisor Leahy. Is there a second?
Second by Fisher.
Have you, so we have a motion and a second to adopt. Have you had any subsequent discussions with the Convention Visitors Bureau?
At this point, no, I have not.
All right. So again, I think we would be looking to partner with others, and it would be a maximum expenditure. Any questions? If not, all is in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion carries. Next, employee paid time off balance liability reduction to maintain service level and long-term financial liability. Administrator Leonard, because this is a new concept or a new proposal, I'll turn it over to you for an explanation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And this was our attempt to use, our first attempt to utilize the draft form, and that is in your packet. Essentially, as I spell out within the document, one of the unforeseen impacts of the pandemic is that we did see a significant increase in our paid time off leave liability. And I referenced that within the document, approximately 25,600 hours in terms of an increase over our pre-pandemic levels. And I won't belabor the explanation of why that is, but certainly we can all remember at the early onset of the pandemic, there was a general prohibition on travel that we were all subject to. In terms of organizational impacts, in addition to that, we also had a number of areas where there was significant increase in workload demands throughout the pandemic. Best example of that is certainly within our health department. So for a variety of reasons, individuals were not utilizing the paid time off that they were accumulating. And that, as I spell out in the document, has a twofold liability versus in terms of impact on our organization. One is relative to service level, our ability to deliver services to the public, and the second is a potential financial impact. So the proposal before you would allow for the utilization of American Rescue Plan Act dollars to essentially offer the opportunity to employees, should they meet a couple of eligibility criteria, to participate in a voluntary program. It's not mandated. If employees want to utilize their time off that they've accrued, they certainly are free to do that. But this would essentially allow them to participate in the program that would essentially buy down that paid time off balance in increments of either 40 or 80 hours. So the program that we're looking at in terms of initial criterion is that the individual would need to have a leave balance, a current leave balance at 75% of our pre-pandemic leave cap, which referenced within the document for most employees is at 240 hours. Our thought process in setting that cap was that it would ensure that individuals didn't allow their leave balances to get to too minimal a level, because that likewise can put significant considerations for the organization. The other eligibility criterion relate to their individuals' participation or a prohibition on participation in a PTO bank process we have, where an individual, if they don't have a sufficient amount of paid time off can be donated to them. Those individuals, as spelled out in the document, would be ineligible based on those criterion. But essentially, the overall estimated cost based on our projections at this point, we're looking at approximately $450,000. My request would be for, similar to each of the previous proposals that you have looked at, essentially an amount not to exceed $500,000, and then of course any amount that is not utilized would still be eligible for further allocation by the committee and by the full board. So with that, I don't want to speak to everything within the application. I know each of you had the opportunity to review it, but happy to answer any questions you may have.
I have a question for Christie as it relates to this. So we've encumbered the paid time off as an obligation of the county, and we carry that forward under the GASB rules, do we not? And then if we buy that down with an outside source of funding, does that money go, is there a, there's a reduction in liability, but does that have any impact on fund balance?
No. Actually, not on the PTO. We fully fund the sick leave accrued liability under GASB 18, but not on the PTO balance. It's usually unfunded, so that liability would be correlating to a reduction in the liability on the books at the end of 2022.
Okay, so we are basically making ourselves whole.
Correct.
Any questions? Chair Gibbs.
Just two questions. So as I read this, employees would have to opt in or elect to participate by March 1 of 2022?
Correct. The thought process there is that we want to make sure that, first and foremost, we understand what the total utilization of ARPA funds is going to be, but also if an individual is not going to participate, that they have sufficient time to utilize their PTO and we can plan accordingly as an organization.
Then the only other question I have is individuals that have since retired, that had PTO built up during the pandemic, is there any consideration for them? And then just throw it out as a question.
Can you clarify in terms of consideration?
So in other words, they left, retired from the organization with built-up PTO that didn't utilize and didn't sell back. Are they potentially eligible for coming back to the county and saying, hey, I want to have my PTO now bought down, even though I left it with 40 hours, I left with 40 hours on the books, never got anything for it.
We do have a process where if an individual does
Converts it
hire
to,
is no longer employed here, that they have, I don't know, Molly, do you want to talk to what happens with existing PTO balances? But to the specific answer to your question, this would only be available to current Marathon County employees. If individual is no longer employed, they would not have the opportunity to come back and attempt to take advantage of that program.
We do currently pay out PTO up to a maximum, not the maximum accrual amount, but there's a maximum payout depending on length of service. So that is an opportunity when separating from the county under any condition other than retirement. Retirement is converted into a post-employment health plan account.
okay, all right, thank you.
That answers your question? Any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Again, I think this is a prudent financial move for us with an unfunded liability that arose out of the pandemic, which is why the ARPA funds were given to local governments in the first place.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we approve the resolution of the utilization of ARPA funds up to $500,000 for the employee paid off balance liability reduction program.
Is there
And move to the full board for its consideration.
Fisher to second.
any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. As part of that, I would ask for a report back to this committee in June relative to the amount of that so that we can then free up the remaining balance, or that balance that is not encumbered, so that we don't, at the end of the 2024, find that we've got all this funds that we haven't spent. So if you could report back to us in no later than June.
Certainly, should not be a problem.
Thank you. All right, discussion of presentation to the County Board of Supervisors. So we intend to, in response to some of the questions that we've received from supervisors, do a presentation at next Tuesday's meeting relative to our process. We will go through the application process, some of the timelines, expectations, try to have a flow chart out there, give the recap on some of the changes on the ARPA legislation. We'll probably do a tag team approach to that and determine that over the next week. Is there anything that you think, and I would open this up to non-committee members for suggestions on what we should cover when we make this presentation to the county board? Again, they haven't had the benefit of the hearings that we've had. We can talk a little bit about how those came in and others. But if you were not a member of this committee, what questions would you want answered? Any thoughts? Any thoughts? So again, we'll
Supervisor Leahy.
Go ahead, Supervisor.
Thank you. Are you saying we're going, I mean, I guess my main concern, whatever, is to just make it as accessible as possible to the full board. Like you said, they won't have had the opportunity, unless they've been following along with us this entire time. Are you proposing that we go over the entire process, starting with all of those community meetings, or do you think it's more important to focus on the form that we came up with and how we're going to move forward with those funds?
I think we would use the public hearings in terms of context of public engagement and the fact that we've gone out to the public, but not just dwell on those. We've already presented some of that information to the board, so, but again,
Okay.
we've received these comments. These are the types of projects that we would be looking at. Here's the process by which we will go forward in sort of that flow chart, and again, looking, you have a discussion on the revenue loss or the lost revenue concept and the flexibility associated with that, and move forward. I don't think we want to dwell on what we heard. We can certainly make that available to the county board members as background information.
Okay. Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think keeping some of that work, I think keeping the work that we did, you know, kind of at the minimum and focusing more on the form that we ended up creating, talk about that lost revenue, and then kind of the process moving forward is probably what people are going to be most interested in.
How will
That's
this
my 2 cents anyway.
Right, that's an excellent comment. I think that how this impacts them and how they can interface with it and talk to their constituents and interested groups about what process we're using is the critical message we're trying to develop, to send out. So, other thoughts?
Chair Robinson,
Go ahead.
this is Supervisor Mask. I agree with Supervisor Leahy that simplifying an explanation will make things go a lot smoother. The more simplification, 1, 2, 3, 4 type situation when you're explaining things really goes over a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Supervisor Seiler nodding in agreement. Other thoughts?
Chair Robinson.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
I do agree with Supervisor Leahy's analysis, keeping it more so towards the effective end. You know, here's what we've developed for the report, you know, with the report request. Here's what we've determined based on the final ruling from the state, from the IRS regarding what is applicable for all of the items, including the increase of the lost revenue. And just laying out those couple of things so they can see that, you know, the legwork has been done and what they need to go back if they're receiving requests from their constituents for a project is, here's how you access those funds. You have to take these 10 steps or however many steps in total they become. That way they can be effectively armed with what they need to do to chat with their residents.
Any other thoughts? Any other thoughts? So I think implicit in our adoption of the process is that we would then go out to the parties that thought that they had put an issue before the county and ask them to fill out the form. And we're basically starting with a blank slate. Is everybody in agreement with that interpretation? So while we've historically heard from different people, we certainly can keep those in mind, and that can drive requests from committee members or administration to fill those needs. But if we have requests, and I'm going to point to the Village of Marathon City's request for funding for their capital project, we would ask them to fill out the form so that we have a uniform way of evaluating the project. So we would potentially need to do some outreach with some of those groups that have reached out to us, but we're starting with a clean slate, and we would go from there. So nobody's confused as to whether or not they do or do not need to submit information. Does that make sense? I think from administration's perspective, that will make it easier on them. And then we're not interpreting what their intent is, but rather they're clarifying it for us. All right.
I think that Mr. Chairman, I think that makes most sense. I mean, specifically, we've had several various entities, whether it be the Village of Marathon, whether it be the internal department, CPZ department. If everybody is on the same page, they have to fill out an application. that nothing's going to be considered without an application, then everybody's on the same starting point. And I think that makes the most sense.
Any questions, comments, other suggestions? They've been helpful. All right, we will work with administration on developing that presentation. All right. That is the last item of business on the agenda. Our next meeting is a week from now. Will we be in a position to have an update on tax deed properties? You know, usually we've been dedicating that meeting to other things, but perhaps that meeting, if we decided to go ahead, we should be focused on our 2021 work plan and an update on where we are with some of those tasks. And then we can look at where we are with the tax deed property. So we'll focus in on the sort of the report on the 2021 work plan, which included the tax deed properties and a number of other things, but is that acceptable? We'll do it more from an educational and informative perspective. I'm seeing people nodding. Chair Gibbs?
Just one other thing, if I might, if you could put on the agenda an update on the Marathon County litigation on the opioid. I've got significant update information to provide the committee as to when to expect funding and some other considerations that the committee should be taking into consideration at some point.
As long as we're doing that in Chair McEwen or Vice Chair McEwen's here, we'll also include the work plan and the strategic plan in that discussion. So we will revisit our obligations under the strategic plan. And then the opioid update. So it'll be an educational meeting. Anything else or any other suggestions for future meetings? If not, item 9 is before us. Adjournment. Is there a motion?
So moved.
Moved by Gibbs.
Second by Fisher.
Seconded by Fisher. All those in favor, will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Thank you.